Hello, and welcome to this final session of the Constitution Unit's Annual Conference 2025. I'm Meg Russell, the Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing this session. Over the last couple of days, we've had some fantastic discussions at this conference, starting with the keynote speech from the Minister for the Constitution, Nick Thomas-Symonds, yesterday morning, and then panels discussing standards in public life, the electoral system, the rule of law, and House of Commons reform. The overall focus of the conference has been Labour's constitutional agenda in office, reviewing what's been going on across the constitutional landscape since the general election last year, and what the agenda for the remaining years of this Parliament might be. On this final panel, we're returning to that question in the round. A quick plug that two recent Constitution Unit outputs address exactly this. First, a piece on our blog last week by Lisa James, who joins us here on the screen, reviewing progress against Labour's manifesto commitments on the Constitution. And second, a much larger report, also coordinated by Lisa alongside other authors, entitled The Constitutional Landscape, Options for Reform, which looks into over 30 policy areas in much more detail. You can find those respectively on the Constitution Unit blog and the publication part of our website, and I think links to them have just been popped into the chat for this meeting if you want to click through now. So to round up the conference, we want to return broadly to look across the Constitution, asking what's worked over the last year, perhaps what hasn't worked so well, or what's been overlooked, and what the priorities for the rest of the Parliament should be. We might also touch on the principles of constitutional reform. What should guide these decisions, and what kind of constitution should we be aiming at? We're joined by a fantastic panel to explore these matters. Baroness Dianne Hayter of Kentish Town is a Labour peer and former shadow deputy leader of the House of Lords. She's a hugely experienced politician who's held various frontbench posts and also previously chaired the House of Lords International Developments Committee. Alex Burghart is Conservative MP for Brentwood and Ongar and Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. In the last government, he was a Cabinet Office Minister, meaning that he held similar responsibilities to those now held by Nick Thomas-Symonds and is effectively now his shadow. Sarah Olney is Liberal Democrat MP for Richmond Park and Liberal Democrat spokesperson for the Cabinet Office. Again, Nick Thomas-Symonds' shadow from her party. This makes it very fitting that they're both here to bookend the conference after Nick's speech yesterday. Each of the panelists will speak to us for 5 minutes or so at the start of the session, after which we'll have some discussion between us as a panel and then turn to questions from the audience. If you've got a question that you'd like to ask the panel, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of your screen. And Lisa is here to field the questions. She'll be keeping an eye on them as she comes in and selecting some to put to the speakers in the final part of the session. By default, she'll read out your name alongside your question, but you can submit questions anonymously if you prefer. As always at our events, this question, including the Q&A part, is being recorded and will be posted later on our website and YouTube channel, and it will also subsequently appear as an episode of the Constitution Unit podcast. So you may want to consider that when deciding whether to submit your question anonymously. That's all the admin from me. So let's pass straight over to our panel and to Dianne to get the conversation started. Thanks, Dianne.
Well, thank you, and thank you to those online for giving up one of the sunniest days in the year to be with us. In a sense, I want to start really with the word that you've just used, Meg, which is about what guidance, what are some of the guiding principles to constitutional change? Because my view is that whatever one's particular objectives for constitutional change, yesterday was Nick Thomas-Symonds set his out as basically service, about devolving decision making, about accountability and raising standards. But whenever one sets out as one's objectives, it seems to me that when one looking at constitutional as opposed to just normal legislative changes, the really guiding principle should be that the best of such constitutional changes should, if at all possible, be bipartisan. I think the idea of them being debated both by the public, but even more by the parties. And although we don't have anything in our constitution that says big changes should be by 2/3 majority, there's a sort of the equivalent of that. Actually making constitutional change by 1 or 2 votes doesn't seem to me to be the best way of taking a country forward. So I think if you talk about the underlying view that I have about change, it would be that. But I'm afraid I have to go and stop being a slightly constitutional, I'm not really an academic, but whatever, into being a politician, and say that that approach to constitutional change hasn't been possible over the last decade and a half. Because even in the, not the most recent, but the Conservative Manifesto previously, there was a promise to have a constitutional, I think it was called a constitutional convention. It could have been a assembly or something. But sadly, they never acted on it. And I thought that that approach of setting up something like that was really good, but they didn't do it. And they also refused to move forward on stopping the continuing entry of hereditary peers into the Lords. Although I think that at that time the majority of the Conservatives in the Lords supported it, but the party wouldn't put its shoulder to the wheel. And that seemed to me a shame. I think both parties probably at that stage agreed with that, but they didn't do it. And since the general election, it's actually become even worse because despite there being a very clear Labour Party manifesto commitment to remove all the remaining hereditaries from the Lords as an early priority, the Conservatives in the Lords have sought to both thwart and delay the legislation to make that happen, and indeed have attacked the government seeking to enact their manifesto commitment. That's bad in itself. We'll get over that. But the other problem is that has then delayed the other things that we had floated in the manifesto, which was to consider things like a retirement age for peers, or making their appointments time limited, or having a minimum attendance requirement. And we've not been able to get onto that because we've been bogged down with the hereditary bill. Now, there are problems with those things because, for example, on retirement age, the Labour group in the Lords is much older than the Conservatives and the Lib Dems because we've been out of office for so long. We haven't refreshed our group very much and haven't had many appointments. And similarly, because of that age and infirmity, there are fewer of ours that participate as regularly as the others. So even implementing what we'd thought to look at is difficult. Because of where we are in the composition. And that, of course, was fueled by the very large number of Conservatives put into the Lords by Boris Johnson and his successors, even by one of his successors who only served 49 days as Prime Minister. So we've got the situation now where there are 286 Conservative peers and only 212 Labour ones. That means the Conservatives got 74 more than the governing party. And even after the hereditaries goes, they'll still have 30 more than us. And so we've got a government majority of 156 in the Commons, but in the Lords there are 70 more Tories than Labour. This seems to me a constitutional issue. And we have to deal with that. And I think that I'm afraid it is for the Conservatives to give some thought about whether it's right for them to have such a overwhelming surplus of numbers there. I'll only say one more thing because I know our chair is particularly interested in this, which is the size of the House, and would very much like us to make that a priority for change. My view is that that is not a priority at the moment. The imbalance in the House of Lords, the inability of the government to get its legislation through, I think is undermining the House of Lords and to some extent undermining the House of Commons because we keep sending down to the House of Commons things with enormous majorities against the government, and they so quickly get turned around by the Commons that they're actually not paying due attention to what we've said. I understand it from their point of view because we're sending so many down there, but it seems to me that that is devaluing both the work that the House of Lords could do, but also to some extent devaluing the ability of the Commons to give at least some thought to what we're doing. So I'll finish there saying that I do think that democracy and the Constitution is about having effective checks and balances on a government. And actually, we need to make sure that our constitutional change helps those checks and balance, and that ought to be a priority of how we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dianne. And I did invite people to talk widely across the Constitution. This is not, don't feel, the other two of you, that you have to stick to Lord's reform, but you may want to rise to the bait that's been put in front of you by Dianne, particularly Alex. Give us your opening remarks, and if they don't include what Dianne's been talking about, we can certainly come back to it in questions. But over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Meg. And I assume that sort of Dianne wanted to talk about the Lords because that's really the only constitutional reform that Labour has brought forward at the moment. And I think going up to sort of 30,000 feet, I think what has been where there has been a relief in what the government has done or what Labour has done is to ditch Gordon Brown's constitutional reforms, which were, I think, incredibly stodgy and would have been very difficult to implement, and I think would have caused long-term problems. And that was recognised by Peter Mandelson last March, where the proposals were effectively publicly junked, and it was clear that Labour was going to go to the election with a much more modest set of constitutional proposals, sort of slightly reminiscent of that moment in the '97 Parliament where Jack Straw was given license to trash Paddy Ashdown's proposed constitutional reforms, and it was a little bit of Labour history repeating itself. And I think, yeah, obviously that there is an ongoing debate about future of hereditaries. Of course, the government is going to get its way. What is sort of sad about this in historical terms is that obviously the only reason why the existing hereditaries, the persisting hereditaries are in the Lords is because the last Labour government left them there. And they left them there with a clear direction that they would not take them out until Labour had a settled view on the long-term future of the Lords. Now, it may be that the Labour Party has come to that, but doesn't wish to declare that it has. And I will give due credit to Nick for having made one innovation, which I think is a good one, which is that the suggested, when a government, or when anybody is proposing a candidate to be a peer, the proposing party has to write a passage explaining why this person should is deserving of appointment. I think that is a very simple and light touch change that that will actually make a difference over time. I think that what has been, from my perspective, reassuring about what the current Labour government done is clearly ditched its long-term ambition for an elected house. Something that has been, I think, in every Labour manifesto since 2010, wasn't in 24. And the debates that I've had with Nick in the chamber, it's clear that there's no intention of returning to that. And similarly, it seems that we've seen an end to the idea. Dianne, correct me if I'm wrong. So there is no open advocacy on the front bench in the Commons for limiting the size of the Lords either, which is common with my position. I think that I very much hope the government will drop its plans to enforce a retirement age of 80. There are lots of peers who are over 80 who do a very good job and are a very great experience. And I've always found the proposal very insulting to them, that at a particular moment in their lives they should have to hang up their ermine. So I very much hope that is going to be left on the shelf. As far as the Commons goes, it will be interesting to see whether the government actually does proceed with extending the franchise to 16 and 17-year-olds. When questions have been asked about this in the Commons, ministers have given very light touch commitment to the idea, saying we're looking into it, and when parliamentary time allows. I mean, there is oodles of parliamentary time to do this, should the government wish to. And one wonders whether, as they survey the polls, they realise that actually there are a lot of 16 and 17-year-olds who might vote for other parties given the choice, and that the previous sense that that young cohort was a slam dunk for the Labour Party has evaporated. Something more in a procedural matter for the House of Commons, and so constitutional in a slightly different way, is the so-called modernisation of the House plans, which, if the newspaper reports are right, will contain a proposal for call lists, which I think would be awful for parliamentary debate. I think the idea that MPs will just sort of shuffle in, say their words, listen to two speeches and shuffle out, it would be a terrible thing to have formalised. And I very much hope that the leader of the House does not. I very much hope that does not go ahead with that. I very much hope that the newspaper reports are wrong. So, and I think that Meg, that slightly extends us beyond the House of Lords into the House of Commons. Maybe Sarah will take us even further.
Yes, Sarah, I would invite you to pick it up from there. Feel free to keep talking about those things, but I will try and draw the panel back to some of the other things that have come up earlier in the conference around standards, elections, devolution, etc. So take us wherever you would like, and then we'll start a conversation of a different kind. Sarah.
Thank you very much, Meg. It's a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. I am very pleased to be here representing the Liberal Democrats this afternoon. And I know there's been some really interesting contributions from all sorts of people over the last 2 days. But I obviously paid some attention to the comments of Nick Thomas-Symonds when he opened your conference yesterday. And I was particularly struck when he said we're serious about ensuring that our political system represents every member of our society. And we have exchanges across the House on a number of different occasions. And I have a lot of time for some of the sentiments he expresses. But I think that this government could be going a lot further to achieve that stated ambition that Nick Thomas-Symonds said yesterday. Now, obviously, as a Liberal Democrat, I want to start with electoral reform, because that's what gets the pulse of every Liberal Democrat racing more than anything else. But not least because last year's general election was the most disproportionate result in the UK's history. Labour in the current Parliament have got 2/3 of the seats, and they only attracted 1/3 of the vote. And what we've seen since last year, and it is nearly a year now, is that what appears to be happening is what many people are calling a new multi-party era, although Liberal Democrats would like to be like, well, we've been here actually for quite a lot of that time. But the YouGov polling from last month showed there's just 13 points between the party leading the polls, Reform, obviously with only 5 MPs in the current Parliament, and the party in fourth, which is the Conservatives, which in itself is unprecedented. And it's not just the polls, of course. I think what we were all seeing in the polls, and we're all wondering, is that really reflected in how people are actually going to vote? Last month's local elections showed us, yes, very much so. So we are certainly, I think, in a new era of multi-party politics, and that's why the Liberal Democrats think that the case for electoral reform is more pressing than ever. And the government are not, despite my repeated invitations, are not yet taking this up. I actually won a vote in Parliament just before Christmas with my 10-minute rule bill on proportional representation. So there's a bill there, it exists, and I have invited Pat McFadden, Nick Thomas-Symonds on various occasions to take that up, but so far they've refused to make time. But I was interested in Dianne's comments there about the necessity of constitutional reform needing to be bipartisan, needing to have a 2/3 majority or something of that kind. And of course, it's not just constitutional change that we don't want to push through on small voting majorities. There's a whole wide range of things, and that's why I think voting reform is so important. As I say, particularly with the extent to which the makeup of the current Parliament does not reflect voting preferences. So I'm going to continue to talk to the government about this. The elections bill, which is coming up in the next session of Parliament, will also be pressing the government on return to a more proportional system of voting for mayoral elections, which I think will be particularly pressing given the government's plans to increase the number of mayoralties and for them to have increased powers. And of course, Liberal Democrats have always been strong champions of votes at 16. Labour manifesto, and I believe we've heard the Prime Minister make a specific commitment to votes at 16 in the elections bill. So we will certainly look forward to that. And I'm just picking up on what Alex was saying there about 16 and 17-year-olds. I think there was a recent YouGov and was looking at voting intentions of 18 to 24-year-olds, which actually put the Liberal Democrats as the #1 choice for 18 to 24-year-olds. So that's not the reason why we're pressing the votes at 16. But nevertheless, we certainly look forward to that coming to pass. So the rest of Labour's manifesto commitments is a bit of a mixed record. They had their headline pledge was to establish an ethics and integrity commission to ensure probity in government. And obviously, I think we probably all accepted that was a certain degree of, response to a lot of what we saw happening under the previous Conservative government. Standards in public life were really undermined over the last few years, and not least from the very top by Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister. I don't know why the government haven't yet set up this commission. It's something that my colleague in the House of Lords, Lord Wallace of Saltaire, has been pushing very hard on, and we will continue to ask those questions. We were really pleased to see the legislation on abolishing hereditary peers, something we very much support. But again, we've got questions about why the government isn't yet going further. Removing hereditary peers is something that the Liberal Democrats have called for a long time, but we want to see broader and bolder reform of the upper chamber. And I tabled 2 amendments to the legislation when it was in the Commons to extend the powers. We want to see an elected House of Lords, and we want to ensure that the House of Lords Appointment Commission can't be sidestepped and ignored like we often saw under the last government. And I want to know what's happened to Labour's promises around the retirement age of 80. The opportunity has been there to introduce that, and yet they still haven't done it. And we would support the cutting of the number of Lords in the House of Lords. We'll support the findings of the Burns report when it reported in 2017, which is getting on for 8 years ago now, that the House of Lords should be cut to 600 peers, which is something that we would very much support. So we know that Labour's priorities over the last 11 and a half months now have been focused on tidying up the economy. We understand that that's the big pressure, and obviously lots of foreign affairs pressures as well in that time, some expected, some less so. But we think strengthening, protecting our electoral systems is of vital importance, particularly in the current climate. And we look forward to being a constructive opposition on those points. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to all our panelists. Let me just remind you, as of what I said at the start, that we are going to move to audience questions in due course. If you've got a question for the panel, please put it in the Q&A function of Zoom, and we'll wait for a few of those to accumulate. And while that's happening, I'll ask some questions to the panel. It was interesting that Dianne was the one who rose to the challenge of what the principles might be guiding constitutional reform. So I think I'd like to go back to that general question and maybe go in reverse order and ask Sarah and then Alex, and then come back to Dianne at the end. I think there are various ways that you can answer that question. Dianne talked about process, about cross-party agreement, which is a really interesting principle, and it actually, given the nature of this panel, is one of the things I was going to press you on. So you might want to speak about that and whether you think there are areas where the parties can work together and are less likely to do so. But more generally, I think I was thinking about things Dianne did repeat, to be fair, things that Nick Thomas Symonds has emphasised in terms of accountability and trust and service and so on. I suppose I'm thinking about things like, do we think the Constitution is too centralised? Do we think it should be more decentralised? Do we think we have adequate checks and balances? Should we be looking to strengthen checks and balances? And within that, are there sort of particular institutions in the Constitution that maybe you think should be strengthened over others? Sarah, can I come to you and then I'll go to Alex, and then Dianne could pick up the bits of that question that she didn't already answer in her opening remarks, perhaps.
So your questions around the principles of constitutional reform, and I think I'll go back to sort of the start of my opening remarks, because I really do think that this issue of representation is absolutely critical, because without repeating everything I said, we have got a very unbalanced parliament at the moment in terms of how people's voting has been translated into parliament. And I think that is unsettling in lots of different ways. We're certainly at the moment seeing a big upswing in disenchantment with politics. And I think that's a very, very serious threat that we all of us need to take seriously and think about how we respond to. But I do think that part of that disenchantment does come about because, well, I voted for this, they promised to deliver that, it's not happening. You know, and sometimes that's voters being impatient. Change takes time. Sometimes it's, well, you voted for that thing, but actually the other party won, so you can't have the thing you voted for. Is, you know, obviously a normal part of democracy. But I think it, you know, the more widespread and deeper sense of disenchantment that we have at the moment, I do think partly that is related to the fact that Parliament does not represent what voters voted for last July, and I do think that that's a really, really critical issue that we need to address. I think you raise an interesting point about decentralising the constitution, and again, I think that is exactly right. I'm not 100% convinced by the sort of the white paper that we've seen about the changes that Angela Rayner's departments are proposing to local government. But I definitely think that there is, I mean, you know, across so many different things, we see decisions being made in Westminster that would be so much more effective if they were made by locally accountable politicians much closer to the areas where those decisions are going to impact. I was in the chamber earlier today for the statement by the Chief Secretary of the Treasury about infrastructure spending, and he's making an announcement about an amount of money that the Treasury are making available. And every MP is popping up to ask about whether their hospital or their road junction or their... And that's what accountability is, but it's a little bit mad to me that when my colleague Tim Farron is asking about, you know, closures on the M6, he's asking the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, as opposed to there being a body somewhere in the northwest of England that can actually make those decisions, those operational decisions about how closures on the M6 can be best coordinated to minimise the impact on local people. So there's absolutely, I think, much more that can be done to sort of decentralize decision making. But I think overall, when you talked about checks and balances, I think it's really, again, about the opportunities for scrutiny. What does scrutiny mean? How does scrutiny work? Going back to this is an unbalanced parliament in terms of not actually reflecting what people voted for. How does that impact the quality of scrutiny? And there's a lot that we do in Parliament that's kind of based on an assumption of a two-party system. And it's not just that we are, and the Conservatives at the moment are less than half of all opposition MPs, which I think is an unprecedented situation. So yes, there's still a formal Majesty's loyal opposition, but, you know, and also obviously what I see very much is that the difference in the last Parliament, where Liberal Democrats and Labour in opposition in the last Parliament found alignment on a great deal of things. Now we've got, you know, the two biggest opposition parties, and obviously the third party is a lot bigger than it used to be, actually quite fundamentally opposed on many things. So, you know, if scrutiny relies on a sort of large united opposition, that we simply don't have that in the current Parliament. So we do need, I think, to update some of our practices to sort of really recognise that. I've made a point here about devolution as well. I just think we have a UK Parliament, we have Scottish and Welsh Parliaments. That still creates a lot of friction, a lot of duplication, and just a lot of anomalies that we haven't really ironed out. And I would love to see Labour getting to grips with that.
Thank you. Unsurprisingly, the point about the balance between the Liberal Democrats and Conservatives in the House of Commons came up in our previous panel just earlier this afternoon, where the Liberal Democrat Chief Whip, Wendy Chamberlain, was on the panel. Alex, you might want to comment on that, but on other things. What do you think the key principles are that should be guiding what we do with the Constitution in terms of these questions about sort of checks and balances and so on, and balance between different institutions?
So I think that and one of the things that Kemi Badenoch has spoken about a number of times in the past year is the importance of governments, whoever is in power, democratically elected governments, being able to enact what they have been elected to do. And it's clear that in a number of areas, a sort of encroaching legalism is making that increasingly difficult. And we are obviously, as a country now, starting to have a much deeper debate about the validity of our international legal obligations and the way in which judicial review works. And I think ultimately, there's slightly different emphasis than the one that Sarah put on. Ultimately, if Parliament agrees something, then it should happen. And if a government decides that it is going to do something, if it's going to build infrastructure, if it's going to build housing, this should not be a process that is then endlessly litigated in the courts at huge cost and huge delay. And that is to say that we need to go back to a system where Parliament makes the laws, where ministers decide things, and if people don't like those decisions, there are elections, and they can get rid of those ministers and get other people in. And I do more and more. I feel that that these frustrations are compounding the sense of voter frustration in the country. I think on scrutiny, and I felt this when I was in government. I feel it now I'm in opposition. Something is wrong with parliamentary timetabling. There are sometimes very important issues that do not get the debate time they deserve. And even this week, the abortion amendment that went down, highly controversial, highly emotive, but whatever side of the debate you're on, it's clear that Parliament should have had an opportunity to debate this for far longer than it did. And this is not unusual. Plenty of time in the parliamentary week for more debate on substantive issues. Today we're having a series of general debates on issues that are largely peripheral to most voters' interest. Where when it comes to the crunch, we ought to be much more adaptable to expand the amount of time that we have to debate. Something that you and I have spoken about previously, Meg, that is sort of a sort of pet interest of mine, that is a subject in which there are absolutely no votes at all, but I think is important for for good government, is that I think we need far more pre-legislative scrutiny, and I would sort of strongly support us. We won't always have it. Of course, not all bills. We wouldn't expect any government to always put all of their legislation through pre-legislative scrutiny, but the opportunity to actually help governments deliver effectively on what they're setting out to do is to my mind a bit of a no-brainer. And so I think that we should certainly look into that. I think it would have been a very useful thing if the assisted dying bill had gone through pre-legislative scrutiny. I think it would have greatly enhanced the debate on the subject, and would probably have resulted in the bill being less polarizing in its early stages. But I just picked that out as one example amongst many. So parliamentary sovereignty and parliamentary scrutiny would be two things that would guide my thoughts on future change.
Very interesting. Thank you. Dianne, do you want to respond to any of that or throw in any other thoughts? And then I've got plenty more questions.
Good. A couple of things. First of all, it's always nice to agree with someone. I think what Alex has said about pre-ledge scrutiny is really, really important. I did a pre-ledge scrutiny on what became the defamation bill, and it made a big difference to what went through, and I think everyone's very happy about it. And I think that really worked. We also in the Lords do some post-ledge scrutiny, and I think that's really useful too. Did this bill actually, or act by then, do what was wanted from it? So on that issue. I'm only going to say one thing about age, which was mentioned before, I think Sarah mentioned age. Of course, this year is 80 years after the VE Day. You will not be surprised there were an awful lot of babies born in 1946 and 47. It's a real bulge year. Many of them now in the House of Lords, and we will lose that lovely bulge year if the 80 came in. But anyway, I think the political problem is that Labour's got a much older group. But we should certainly think to move towards that. You could easily have a position where any new appointment know from the beginning that they're leaving, whether it's 70, 75, 80, whatever it is, and they know about it, and therefore it would affect who might go there. I'm afraid I do, and I know you've had a session on PR, but I do have to respond a bit to Sarah, because it seems to me that there's a really good book. I was just trying to find it while Alex was talking, called How Democracies Die. And they are not about failing states, but where there's been a democracy and it's gone. And they talk about what is really important in democracy, and elections is only one part of that. And yet I think those who, and I'm sorry to use the word, Sarah, but slightly obsess about how we elect people into the House, don't realise there are other bits of democracy that are equally important, which may be the rule of law, which may be a free press. It may be about sort of what Peter Hennessy would call the good chaps theory. I know it's very sexist, but in people behaving reasonably and honestly. But even more, it's about how you get rid of a government. I've just come from a meeting with some New Zealand colleagues, and there is enormous disenchantment in New Zealand. So the idea that PR is what causes, or lack of PR, is what causes disenchantment with the political system is simply not right. There's a lot of unhappiness in New Zealand, and yet they do, as you know, have a very established PR system. But even more, it's almost impossible to get rid of a New Zealand government completely, because there's never going to be one party that forms a majority. And I think one has to think very seriously about that, that having a stable government where it's formed of one party, I think is a really important way of stability. I then think, which is interesting, therefore, what was said about, I think Sarah said about Conservatives being less than half of all the non-government MPs, if I heard her rightly. I think that's really interesting, because we need a really good, I think, a single party government on the whole, but we also need a very strong opposition, because that is one of the best places for scrutiny, is in opposition. So I do think those are issues to be discussed, but I would urge Sarah and others like her not to think of this simply in terms of the way of getting people into Parliament, but how a government is put together, how you make sure it can have a single party and therefore can work on its manifesto, and how then you can kick it out, because almost the best thing that can happen sometimes, even though I don't like it happening to my own party, is that they get out after a time.
Thank you, Dianne. I'm keen not to turn this panel into one that relitigates PR, because we did, as you kindly said, have a whole debate on that yesterday, and it's a very good quality debate. And Peter Lamb, MP, Dianne, you would have been proud of him making the case for first past the post. And that video is available now on the Constitution Unit YouTube channel, so please watch that if you want a full debate on PR. Let me touch on some other matters before we go over to the audience questions. I was struck to pick up something that Sarah mentioned. One of the things I probably should have said earlier is that, of course, Dianne is not here representing the government. Dianne is a fully functioning, thinking, independent-minded human being, and shouldn't feel that she has to defend the government or indeed explain what the government's doing, because she's not a minister and she probably doesn't know. So Sarah mentioned the Ethics and Integrity Commission, and I thought that would be an interesting thing to pick up, because I know that Dianne has an interest in strengthening standards. We had a panel on that yesterday as well. And there's been a degree of agreement on that panel, and also at the session that the 82-year-old John Major gave this morning at the Institute of Government. He's certainly still going strong. Regarding our standards regulators and whether some of them ought to be strengthened. Maybe I'll go back to Sarah, actually, and then go to Dianne and then go to Alex. Sarah, you're clearly a proponent of the Ethics and Integrity Commission, but could you be a bit more specific about what it ought to do? Because there's been skepticism. There was skepticism on our panel yesterday and this morning from John Major that Ethics and Integrity Commission is actually the way to go, or whether strengthening individual regulators like HOLAC, which you mentioned, and obviously I know about your amendment on that, which we might ask others' view on, but also ACOBA on business interests, on ministers leaving office and being able to go into lobbying jobs and that kind of thing, that maybe strengthening individual regulators would be a more appropriate way to go. So tell us a bit about that, and then let's get Dianne's view and Alex's view on whether the government's done enough or should do more, and whether an Ethics and Integrity Commission is the answer.
Yes, of course. So, I mean, I think one of the risks when we're talking about ethics and integrity, and particularly in a an adversarial commons system that we have, is that we're often very much sort of making proposals in response to things that are happening. So, there were various scandals of financial irregularity or various other forms of misconduct. And then I think it's relatively typical for opposition parties to then rush out and say, well, we're in power, we will bring in legislation so you can't do this thing and you won't be allowed to do that thing. And, this is obviously appalling, and dare I say, within, I think, days of Labour getting in, they fell foul of all the things they said that were, unacceptable when the Tories did it. So I think it's really important, actually, that we do take a bit of a step back. And that's why I think an independent commission is really important. It's like, well, what do we expect of MPs? What do we expect of ministers? What do we expect of Lords? And Lords and MPs, I think, should be treated differently in this. Obviously, we're elected, but also, to a certain extent, I feel like Lords, they're kind of doing a voluntary role there, in a sense. They get sort of expenses rather than a salary like we do. And so therefore, I think there's a sort of a different level of expectation in terms of what their outside interests could be permitted to be. So I do think it comes to, I think a lot of it has got to do with who's talking to you, who's funding you, what meetings are you having. There obviously has to be a different level of scrutiny of ministers who are making the actual decisions, as opposed to MPs who are merely making the case for particular cases. And I think it's still the case that MPs actually have to report their interests more regularly and to a higher degree of detail than ministers do, which is obviously absurd and is an example of something that, if you had an independent scrutiny of how these things work, would be an immediate anomaly that I think you would want to scrap. So I think it, the advantage of an independent body is it's kind of like, right, well, what are the risks? What are the controls that we need to put on MPs and ministers? But just coming back to something I think Alex was saying before, a power cut here in Portcullis House, took me out for about 5 minutes. But I think I heard Alex saying something about, Parliament has to be allowed to be Parliament. We have to be able to make the rules. I think it is really important that you get the balance right between that kind of independent sort of setting rules, setting standards, and adjudicating and enforcing those, and Parliament still being allowed to be Parliament. I feel like there's a sense of which kind of like there ought to be a whole range of activities that MPs are allowed. There shouldn't really be too many limits on what MPs are allowed to do in order to stand up for the interests of their constituents or to play that broader role in political life. Of course, we should expect to observe the highest standards of behaviour. For example, any kind of sexual misconduct or harassment or anything like that should absolutely not be tolerated in any way. But I think also that sanction has to come from the House, and increasingly it does. In the past, it's been up to political parties to apply those sanctions, and they will if it's in their political interests, and they won't if it's not. And that has obviously created some of this inconsistency, shall we say, in how these things are approached. So I think that's got to be an absolute, flaw, if you like. And that's what you would expect of any professional, in any profession. So, doctors, accountants, teachers, they have professional regulations that they are expected to observe, and there's an enforcement body there. So I think there's that. But then beyond that, I think then there is quite a delicate balance between what's an acceptable standard of, shall we say, of funding or of lobbying or whatever that MPs should be expected to declare, versus what actually should they just be allowed to get on with, because there shouldn't be limits placed on, and at the end of the day, we're MPs. Who tells us what to do? So you have to be, I think, quite careful about how those limits are imposed and how they are applied.
Thank you very much. So let me come to Dianne and roll all this up, because then I'm keen to get to the audience after you and Alex have answered. So on regulation, I know that you're very much an advocate of stronger standards regulation. Do you think the Ethics and Integrity Commission is the way to go, or the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments? That's what John Major was saying this morning, should be strengthened, maybe rather than the Ethics and Integrity Commission. And what about the House of Lords Appointments Commission? Sarah and her party have this proposal that the Prime Minister shouldn't be able to overrule it on propriety. John Major this morning actually went further, suggesting that it should be able to rule on the suitability of members for the House of Lords. For example, whether they're going to turn up enough and so on. You're shaking your head. I'm getting a sense of your answer, but tell us what you think.
I think some of the things Sarah said are just really, really important. The idea that a lot of proposals come up in response to scandals. The shorthand is the Dangerous Dogs Bill, but it can happen in everything. And a number of our institutions are exactly that. But I think the discussion about the powers of these bodies is the wrong starting place. Let's see what it is we're trying to do and what rules we need, and then look at which bodies can most deliver that. And it seems to me a discussion about whether it should be this commission or it could be that committee or whatever isn't quite the point. We need to say, are there, basic a code of practice, if you like, that you have to stand up to? And if there is, and if we can agree that, then what is the simplest or the best way of setting the standards in that, and then making sure that they're enforced? And all these different bodies slightly worry me, and I'm really sorry to Alex and Sarah, because I now have to do a bit against the coalition government. Before Sarah's time, I think before Alex's time, yes. But we had the wonderful opportunity there when we set up a regulator of lobbyists, and the coalition government ducked it. So all they did was get consultatives who are lobbyists, consultant lobbyists, to have to register. So if you're a sort of campaign against the arms trade and you're very small and you get in Hayter and Hayter consultants to do it, Hayter and Hayter has to regulate. But the defence industry, because they're in-house, can have 450 lobbyists working for, I don't know, name me a defence contract, and that isn't regulated, and they don't have to declare what they're doing. It was shameful. And so the discussion shouldn't be, even if we change that, about what is the right regulator. We should start from what is it we're trying to regulate. And ideally, we would have one body to do this. I mean, it does seem to me absurd. We've got lots of different bodies doing lots of different things. And actually, they therefore aren't talking to each other. They're not learning lessons. They're not doing a proper risk assessments, which is what any regulator, as Meg says, I do a lot of regulation of the professions. And you have to have a risk assessment as to what issues or what individuals should be doing a flag. And if you've got lots of different regulators, frankly, you can't have that intelligence. So I think we're looking at this wrong way up. I fear it won't be the time for a major look at this, and I'm really sorry, but it seems to me more important that we define what we expect of behaviours, and then say what's the best way of affecting that. How do we do intelligence gathering? Do we only wait for people to complain, or are we out looking for things? That's the sort of debate I would like to see. So we define the aims, and then look at who should do the adjudication. But I would hold on very much to something that Sarah said. that Parliament, I mean, the idea of an independent commissioner, I always find rather funny. Who's it reporting to? Who's going to appoint it? Very hard to have a completely independent organisation. Finally, it does have to come back to Parliament. And I'm afraid having a HOLAC telling a Prime Minister who is suitable to become a minister in the House of Lords is really quite absurd. The idea that someone would overturn and think they knew better than a Prime Minister. If the Prime Minister appoints someone very stupid to be a minister, then the Prime Minister must take responsibility for that.
I'm seeing there might be some agreement here between you and Alex, who was nodding. Alex, if you can make it quick, I'd like to get to the audience because I'm aware Sarah actually has to leave at 4, and that way she might get in an answer to 1 or 2 audience questions before she goes.
Well, I'm going to agree vociferously with Dianne's last point, in that I really don't like the idea of an unelected body effectively becoming the ultimate gatekeeper on who goes into the Lords. You know, there are our system is peculiar. I think it's peculiar for very good reason. And if you're not going to have an elected house, and I think because we don't want to have constant constitutional gridlock and deadlock, we don't want that, and that means you have to have an appointed house. And if you have an appointed house, then it should obviously be primarily appointed by someone who can be removed by democratic means. And so for all of its strangeness, I think our system is a good one when it is used responsibly, and I think most of the time it is. And going back to the point about ethics and integrity, and it's sort of been, I think Dianne lent in this direction as well, that there is a danger that we can overcomplicate these things, right? What do we really need? We need transparency, and we need democracy, and we also need, in extremis, the ability to remove people who have broken the law and committed terrible wrongs. And there should be, there obviously should be provision to prevent people immediately leaving government and going straight into business. But to my mind, that's about it. And that we run the risk of creating a system which tries to prevent anything bad ever happening, and which is a task in which it will inevitably fail, but create a large and monstrous bureaucracy in the meantime that slows everything down and has people worrying that they're accidentally going to break some rule that they were unaware of. I'll end it there, Meg, so that you can go to the audience as you wish.
Great. Well, let's bring Lisa back onto the screen then, who I'm sure has been going through the audience questions and has some good stuff for us. Lisa.
I do indeed. Thank you to everyone who's put questions in so far. We're going to start with a round of 3, which all pick up on things that panelists have mentioned so far, and all tackle parliamentary topics. So our first question is from Arabella Lang, who asks, if Parliament had to approve international agreements, what effect does the panel think that would have on Alex's concern about the relationship between international law and parliamentary sovereignty? And then an anonymous question to Alex on timetabling. Shouldn't we have an empowered House Business Committee? This seems the natural conclusion of your argument. And finally, Jeff Horn directs a question at Sarah. Would Lord Wallace of Saltaire, born 1941, support a retirement age of 80? Isn't he an example of the benefits of experience in the Lords as a revising chamber?
Well, as I said, I'm very keen to bring Sarah into this round. We have 6 minutes before Sarah's going to go, so I'll put her on this question first, and then the challenge to the other 2 is whether we get through the other questions in 6 minutes and bring her in on another.
Well, I'll just take that last one first. I think Lord Wallace has been a panelist, or he's certainly been attending the conference. So, and he may even be one of the attendees as we speak. So, I've got to tell you, he's an excellent peer. And even when the retirement age of 80 is brought in, it would be an extremely sad loss to the House of Lords and to the Liberal Democrats. So, it would undoubtedly be you know, a great shame. However, he and I have had this conversation, and he is, you know, if that's even when Labour want to bring that in, and if it applies to people who are currently in the Lords as opposed to, you know, a potential sort of rollout for future peers, then he's my understanding he's ready to go. But as I say, it would be a huge loss. But it's something I think we would then need to be preparing for. I think Diane's talked about the age of the Labour group in the House of Lords. I think there's been a couple of new additions to the Lib Dem lineup in the Lords who are, you know, bringing the average age down a little bit, but we're probably not that far off the Labour average age. So it would be a bit of an issue for us as well. But it honestly, that's then an opportunity to really, and that's why we want to see it as part of that wider reform, because it's like, what's our House of Lords for? You know, who do we want to have in the House of Lords? And if we're going to start thinking about refreshing the benches and thinking about you know, then it's a great opportunity to start, you know, actively recruiting almost, because what we certainly want to get away from is the idea that it's just there as some sort of reward for service, particularly if it's reward for donations, which I'm afraid it often does seem to be. So, you know, it creates an opportunity to, you know, to refresh who's on the benches, and younger people with an opportunity, you know, to make a real contribution. We can actively recruit.
Do you have thoughts on the House Business Committee or international agreements?
Yes, on the Modernisation Committee, this is one of the recommendations, or one of the requests that the Liberal Democrats have as a party put into the Modernisation Committee. We absolutely want to see a House Business Committee.
By which we mean, I think, a cross-party body which would have the responsibility for scheduling business in the Commons, rather than it being for the government to decide that.
Indeed,
disentangle the jargon.
That's exactly what we would like to see. So just a flat yes on that one. The point about international agreements getting parliamentary approval, something else we're very much in favour of. I think in the last Parliament we were talking about the trade bill, which and this was something we were pushing for at the time. At the moment, international agreements are done under CRAG, and it's entirely unsatisfactory. It is not a way to scrutinise international treaties, and then at the very least there needs to be considerably more debate and ideally votes.
Fantastic. Watching the clock, I think it's very unlikely that we're going to get in another round of questions in the next 3 minutes. So maybe I'll say thank you to Sarah at this point, and let's pass over to Alex, and then I think Dianne could entertain us for about an hour on international agreements, but we should try and get to another round of questions.
So on international agreements, obviously, international agreements end up being enacted in UK law by having primary legislation passed. So the idea that Parliament isn't involved in it in some way, I think, is sort of misguided. The point that I was making really was that the UK signed up to the ECHR after the war, when it was really a very different convention to the one it's become with the living instrument. And so, yeah, in that case, you have, we had assent to one set of rules that have become a very different set of rules down the line. On the point of House business, I know it's a fair question, and it's something that I have thought about in the past. The truth is that if such a committee, if a House Business Committee sort of came into being and started to set the timetable in a way that the government didn't like, eventually a government with a majority is just going to shoot it down, because this is how Parliament works. So I think, nice though it sounds, what we really need is a government with a majority to look again at the changes to House business that were made in the '97 Parliament, and say we are going to create more parliamentary time for important subjects, and if that means the House sitting late sometimes, we will do that. If that means doing more legislation on Thursdays, we will do that. If that means the House sitting more on Fridays, we'll do that. But the most important thing is making time available for scrutiny, and I hope this government and future governments will acknowledge the importance of that. And then there was a third point, Meg, and I've forgotten what it was. Sorry, you're muted, Meg.
Sorry, you took me by surprise there. It was about retirement age from the House of Lords, and specifically William Wallace, who I see has written in saying, I support the retirement age and will accept that, because he is indeed in the audience. You will indeed be sorely missed, William, if it comes to it.
his lordship is sort of too loyal by half. I just think it's a very bad policy that will get rid of some very good parliamentarians for really no good reason whatsoever, and I hope the government ditches it.
That's interesting, because I thought that this might be one of the things on which there was going to be some cross-party agreement after the Hereditary Peers Bill had gone through.
Definitely not. No, this
Interesting.
is. I don't. Yeah. There's. Why should you? You're going to get rid of David Blunkett or Alfred Lord Dubs? Well, to what good end? I mean, where's the fun in that? All this is some spad in Labour HQ thinking, oh, how do we reduce the size of the House of Lords so we can introduce some more of our own people without getting it in the net? Just forget about it. It doesn't matter if the House of Lords becomes slightly larger at times. It doesn't matter at all. The public aren't exercised about it. In many years of political campaigning, I can promise you, everyone on this call, that no one has ever raised the size of the House of Lords with me on a doorstep or in correspondence. It is an SW1A issue and nothing more.
Dianne, I did want to hear you on international agreements, but might be tempted to ask you whether you agree then with Nick Thomas-Symonds, who said yesterday that he was hoping that we would be entering a more consensual phase of House of Lords reform after this has gone through. Do you see hope for that?
Well, I am hoping so. I mean, it's become pretty toxic just now over the hereditaries. And, had the last government agreed with the plan that we should keep the existing hereditaries over the last 10 years, but just not put anyone in by-elections, this would never have been an issue. We would probably only have 30 of them, 40 of them left now, and it wouldn't be an issue. But anyway, that's gone. About age, by the way, turkeys and Christmas do come to mind. But Arabella's question, I'm loath to answer it because, of course, Arabella Lang knows far more about this than just about anyone else and gave evidence recently to the House of Lords International Agreements Committee about parliamentary scrutiny. I mean, the thing is that the CRAG, which was referred to, which is the act under which Parliament can look at this, was written in the wash-up in 2010 when we were still in the European Union, and therefore our trade deals were basically done by the European Union, and that piece of legislation is way out of date because then we had British members of the European Parliament and they could scrutinise those trade deals. So I do think, and I know that she and I and others agree on this, we do need to alter that piece of legislation.
And is there any sign of movement from the government?
Oh, in opposition, they promised it. Well, Alex is the only MP on the panel left, but it means that we in the Lords do some really, really hard work on these trade agreements. We have a lot of evidence, we go through them very carefully, we make very careful views on it. But of course, quite rightly, we don't have a veto. The only people who could say no to an international agreement, a treaty being ratified, is the House of Commons. And there is no way that the opposition can get a debate on that to be able to have a vote if it wanted to say no. Because it's just done basically under Crown prerogative, and the Act doesn't enforce a debate in the Commons. There are a number of people who think that the need for parliamentary approval, which would happen in America by Congress, actually is a strong negotiating arm for a government. I haven't negotiated a treaty. I don't know whether that's the case, but certainly when the European Union, and still are, of course, without us negotiating treaties, they knew it had to go through the European Parliament, and it doesn't seem to be a problem. It isn't in America. So I'm very much hoping that the committee that Arabella gave evidence to will shortly come out with a strong call for the House of Commons to be able to do. It needn't do all the hard work. We'll do that. We'll do that detailed scrutiny. But I do think that our recommendation ought to go to the House of Commons. They could then reject it, or they could approve it.
Okay. We've lost Sarah, but we've got plenty of talent on the panel and plenty of questions. So back to Lisa. It would be nice to fit in another 2 rounds. It might require slightly short answers from the panelists, but it depends how varied the questions are. What have you got for us, Lisa?
Well, I'm going to pose a slightly shorter round of just 2 questions to help us to fit everything in. So, John Cummings asks, are you aware of Wales' process of developing innovative democratic institutions at all levels, from local to national, and including deliberative democratic assemblies, sortition-based, mini-publics, citizens' assemblies, etc.? Could the Labour review, and based on when this question came in, I think this is a reference to the thinking on the long-term future of the Lords, include such measures? And Matthew Din asks, with regard to English devolution, should more be done to improve scrutiny of metro mayors given their increased powers, for example, through elected regional assemblies?
Interesting. Who'd like to go first on these? Was that an offer, Dianne, or a passing to Alex? Dianne is muted, but she's talking.
I was passing it to Alex, but I'm happy to do it because being Welsh, everything that Wales do is perfect. And certainly the work they've done, which led to the I think it's called Future Generations, John, isn't it? Something like that. Future Generations has been, I think, really innovative and arose out from wide-scale discussions. Of course, Wales is much, much smaller. It's less than half the size of London, and it does have that ability to do things that I think nationwide is much more difficult. I like the idea of citizens' panels, but not as decision makers, but to be able to help policymakers hear the reaction to how you. A lot of legislation is great on principle. It might even be good in an act of parliament. It's the implementation that matters. And if we could get some of those discussions about, well, if we did this, how would it be implemented? I just think some of that, or the equivalent of an impact assessment done with a wider group of people. I hope there are no economists on the line, rather than just a few economists trying to do an impact assessment. If we took out some of our proposals and got those digested by people who would have to, enact with them or lead with them on the ground, that could be really helpful. I don't think it's a replacement for decision making, but I do think it's an aid to good decision making. I have no particular views on metro mayors because our London mayor, obviously, where I am at the moment, does have an assembly.
Does have a scrutiny, body. Alex.
So the first question was about sort of Wales and democratic innovation, and the second question was
about whether we also ought to be looking to strengthen scrutiny of metro mayors through specifically, Lisa, elected assemblies.
Yeah, that's the example from the question, but just an example. I think others could be proposed.
I think there might be other methods of scrutiny short of that also.
I mean, I would certainly like to see the elected mayors who increasingly have large amounts of public money at their disposal be regularly in front of select committees in Westminster, both in the Lords and in the Commons. And I think that you're more likely to get the questioning that is both relevant to the region and the wider economy if it's done there. I know no objection to considering other things locally, but I think there is a power and authority in Westminster select committees which could be honed more often on elected mayors. I think in terms of democratic innovation, I mean, I think that there are lots of ways in which one can and should consult the public when forming policy, when thinking about the implementation of policy. I think citizens' assemblies, I shall again agree with Dan on this. I don't think they should be decision-making bodies at all. I mean, we have a democratic structure that we use and have used for a very long time in order to create those decision-making processes. I don't see any value in that being usurped by a group of people chosen at random. But in certain specific circumstances, they may be useful ways of gauging public opinion. However, I and when I was in the Cabinet Office, I looked very deeply into citizen assemblies, and I felt that there was a very high degree of risk that that they would find that if they were set up on significant issues, they would find themselves, the people in them would find themselves placed under enormous personal pressure, in a way that we're sort of we expect to have to deal with that as elected politicians, as members of the House of Lords. We know that that goes with the territory, but I think it would end up being quite brutal for members of the public selected around. So I am wary about the way in which the modern campaigning and lobbying nexus would treat them, and so I would be very, very cautious about using them systematically.
Interesting. Now we're getting very short of time. Lisa, I don't know whether you've got one or two short and simple questions that our panelists could squeeze in their answers to.
I can't promise simple, but I can give you two. So first of all, a couple of anonymous questions. Bipartisanship seems important on constitutional reform. So should we consider free votes on major constitutional reform, or stronger or different elements to the legislative process? We actually had a separate question asking specifically about protective mechanisms for major changes to the devolution settlements. And then, what constitutional reforms do you believe could best address the UK's current political polarisation and restore public trust in democratic institutions?
Oh, just that little thing. If we could sort that out in the next 3 minutes, that would be a perfect end to the conference. Alex.
On the second point, I would just say again, you have to have, to my mind, proper parliamentary sovereignty, and you have to have governments with license to do what they're elected to do, and the public retaining the right to vote them out. And so I think that is what we have to strive to get back to. On the first point, I'm sorry to do this again. Lisa, can you explain that question to me again?
Yeah, of course. So the question was, should we have either free votes on major constitutional reform, or some kind of enhanced legislative process for putting constitutional reforms through?
Good luck with having free votes on constitutional reforms. I'm sure chief whips of all parties would have some pretty stern words to say on that.
It's been done on House of Lords reform with very little success in the past.
Yeah, exactly. I don't see that one taking hold. And in terms of an enhanced process for constitutional reform, and I sort of feel very strongly that if, for example, a future government were to want to bring in an elected upper house, which would be a huge constitutional change, I do think that's the sort of thing that you ought to have a referendum on. And I do think that, by and large, the convention that we have developed over the past 30 years, where major constitutional issues are put direct to the public, is a convention that we should adhere to.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Dianne, final word.
I went through Brexit. I'm against referenda forever, ever and ever. I mean, no, that's a joke, but I don't like referenda. Sarah's not here, but otherwise I would remind her we had a referendum on PR, and her side lost. I think the bigger issue, though, is I think with constitutional change, what one doesn't want, our constitution evolves. That's the way we happen to do it in this country, and even now, our constitution is so different. I've been in Lords a long time. I've been in 15 years, and the change in that period, let alone during my lifetime, is enormous. We only had women in the Lords really since 1958. When I got to the Lords, there were no women bishops at all in the Church of England. Now, not only are there bishops in the Church of England, but I think there are 5 women bishops in the House of Lords. So we do make these changes, and getting rid of most of the hereditaries was one change. We'll now have done that. So what's important to me is we don't flip-flop. And that's the other advantage of a bipartisan approach. It's not simply that you're likely to get better changes, but what you don't want is a constitutional change, which then with another government coming in, you change that. Because I think that it's really important for people to feel very secure and to understand their constitution and their constitutional rights. So there's a lot of advantage of being able to move forward with a, if not an absolute interest, at least the awareness that the other side won't then change it over. So we're going to have this constitution altering all the time. So I think that we do protect, and that's the way we've got on devolution. We made a great big change, which did have referenda, it's true. But since then, of course, there's been further changes. I think we had a Welsh Assembly to begin with, and we've now got the Synod, and we've got more the spending and fundraising abilities for them. So we tend to do gradual change. I think that's right, and we don't tend to roll things back, which is where I think the bipartisan helps achieve that.
You have neatly wound us back right to your opening point. Well done for that. Thank you very much. We're obviously now on borrowed time. So sadly, that brings us to the end of this session and indeed the end of the Constitution Unit Conference 2025. Let me start by very warmly thanking our three excellent panelists on this session, Dianne, Hayter, Alex Burghart and Sarah Olney, and Lisa for handling the questions, and my colleagues Rowan and Ed behind the scenes for managing this session and indeed all of the other sessions of this conference so very smoothly. Thank you to all of the other speakers who have joined us, the other question handlers, the other chairs throughout the conference, and to our very engaged audience for attending and for all of their excellent questions. Just to re-emphasize that this session and all the previous sessions at the conference will be available on video on the Constitution Unit website and YouTube channel, and they'll all appear as episodes of the Constitution Unit podcast in the weeks ahead. So do tune in and share these materials if you found this an enjoyable event, as well as looking at the written materials on our website. And if you're not already signed up to our mailing lists and social media channels, please do so you'll be the first to hear news of our events and publications. You can find details of how to do so if you go to the Constitution Unit website and look at the Get Involved area. Despite having just come to the end of a great long conference, we do have our next event already lined up. It's on a topic that we didn't very fully cover at the conference, English devolution. It takes place at lunchtime on the 10th of July with a great panel. So again, I think the link has probably just been dropped in the chat, but you can also find details of that on our website and sign up, and we hope to see many of you there. So once again, thank you to everybody who's been involved in this panel and this conference for your many contributions. And goodbye from us.